You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the 95 Podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director at 95 Network. Today, I'm so thrilled to be hanging out with Lance Witt again. I think, Lance, this is your third podcast with us, if I remember correctly. You wrote the book Replenish, and then you wrote a couple other books, one about building healthy teams. But most of all, as I just told you off mic here, this is just a therapy session for me. So I'm glad to have the time that you could work me in today. So how are you doing, Lance?
If you want to lay on the couch, feel free to do so.
Well, I might just do that. So how are you doing?
I'm doing good, and this has been a really good season of life and ministry for us, and
Awesome.
so I'm in a great place and loving my life these days. So I'm excited to get to spend a little time with you and hopefully see if we can help some other leaders.
Well, let's do this. For those who may not have heard you speak on the other podcasts or be familiar, take a few moments and give us a little bit of the backstory of Lance.
Oh, wow. Well, on the personal side, my wife Connie and I have been married for 46 years, which kind of feels surreal to even say that. And I often tell people that's because we got married when we were 9.
Yeah.
46 years, we have 2 grown kids, both married. And the best thing about my kids is they produce grandkids.
Yes.
And we have 4
Amen.
beautiful granddaughters, 2 that are 12, 2 that are 10. And what we didn't know when we moved to Colorado 13 years ago is that our kids would actually follow us. And so our entire tribe lives within about a mile and a half of me now. So we feel like we're kind of living the dream.
That's so awesome.
And on the ministry side of things, I became a lead pastor when I was 23, which
Wow.
I feel like I should go back and apologize to my congregation from those days. But I was a senior pastor for 20 years prior to joining the staff at Saddleback Church in 1999. And I was there when Rick wrote the book Purpose Driven Life. And that was such a game changer for him, for our entire church and team. And during those days, I was the executive pastor over all the ministry side of the church, and then was one of the teaching pastors. Much longer story, but after 7 years of being there, not leading myself well, living in a very sort of pressure-packed, high-paced, fast-paced environment, we decided to step away without another place to go, without another church or another job. And I was kind of in my mid-40s, a little bit lost and confused, and through a very clear, pretty dramatic sense of call, God called me to help leaders be healthy, holy, and humble. And that was the beginnings of Replenish, which I've now been doing for 18 years. And really, Replenish is really mostly, Dale, my own journey of trying to learn what it looks like to live and lead from a healthy soul and bring my own soul back to life, because I was not in a good place when I left Saddleback. And so God's allowed me the privilege now to come alongside other leaders and be a friend to pastors and leaders and help them figure out how to actually live from a healthy place, and then out of living from a healthy place, lead from a healthy place.
Well, if you have not listened to the podcast, I'll actually add it to the show notes for this particular podcast. Our first one together was all about the book Replenish and the impact it had on me personally. And then also it had a huge impact on some friends of mine who were all working in larger churches, and they were probably in the same place that you found yourself, just completely frazzled and worn out and with no end in sight. So I'll definitely add that. Now, you've written a couple of books since Replenish. What are those books?
Yeah. So following Replenish, I wrote a book called High Impact Teams. And the tagline is where healthy meets high performance. And so, as you know, with Replenish, I'm such a big proponent of health, but I also am a leader and realize that we are on mission, and that, have a stewardship responsibility to be effective and productive with our assignment from God. And so the idea behind high impact teams is, what is it like to bring the synergy of both health and high performance to your team environment? And so that's kind of the essence of me bringing I don't know, 40 years of practical experience of leading teams and probably being a bad leader of teams on many occasions, but trying to help churches know how to practically lead good, healthy, and high-performing teams. And then the third book I wrote is called Your One Life, and it was been out now a couple of years. Really, Dale, it's kind of like my life message. And I almost, when I wrote the book, I thought, like, what would, if I could sit down with my grandkids
Yeah.
and share with them, how do you live an amazing life? And how do you steward well the one and only life you're ever going to have? That's the essence of that book. After being on the planet for 6 decades, what I would say to someone about how to live a rich and meaningful life.
Yeah. I remember, I don't know if it's a sermon or a book, because if it's a book, I haven't read it, but John Piper had, I think it was a book out called Don't Waste Your Life. And
Yeah.
just the
Yep.
title of that rocked my world.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, because you don't want to do that. You want it to count. And I'm a wired worker anyway. I'm one of those guys that can't do enough, and that's what led to me writing Stalled, because I
Yep.
got to a point to where I couldn't find that balance, which is kind of what I want us to do today. We've done several podcasts recently just about dealing with stress, working through difficult seasons. And again, I'm sure a lot of that I just do out of the reflection of, my wife and I, Gina, have been building a house for, it seems like 2 decades, but we moved in the house a few weeks ago. We bought the property 2 years ago. So, but we've been building the house really for 9 months. And when I say we've been building it, we have been doing the construction. I grew up doing construction, and still leading 95 Network and traveling and doing it. And I have not felt like I feel now, maybe ever. But
Mm,
I think part of that's being 62 and doing this versus,
yeah.
being a kid doing this. So I
Right.
understand exhaustion and that kind of thing. And then you and I both personally, we experienced the loss of Tony Morgan together.
Yeah.
And
Me
I
too.
still, I haven't been able to get a handle on that yet. Have you been able to process it any?
No, I think it just came so out of the blue. And, my time and years of knowing Tony, he was just such a healthy guy,
Yep.
fit guy, just, never really any significant health challenges. And then all of a sudden you get the call that, he's working in his backyard and had a heart attack. And then, there was a little bit of hope that he was going to pull out of it and get better. And then you get the call like, no, he actually has passed away and gone on to be with the Lord. And like, yeah, I just for days just kind of was in a bit of a funk. And just like I would wake up and just think like, wow, my friend Tony is actually gone. Like
Yeah.
he is not with us anymore. And such a loss to the kingdom. And just one of the truly most, like he was on the backstage who he actually portrayed himself
Yes.
to be on the front stage. Like there was no difference between Tony in public or
Yes.
Tony the writer and ministry leader versus Tony the friend and dad and
Hmm.
husband, and just just a great guy and a tremendous loss personally, but also just for the kingdom.
Yeah. I don't think I would be where I am today without Tony.
Mm. Yeah.
Tony intersected me at a time when I was just uh, basically felt like God had put me on a shelf, and
Yeah.
that I was done. And Tony, just through one conversation, helped to just turn my life around. And then I served
Wow.
with the Unstuck group for a couple of years, and then a lot of how I lead and what I do at 95 Network is stuff that I learned from him. Our family was, my oldest daughter Tiffany works for the Unstuck group, and we were all together on Labor Day at the pool when she got the text that what had happened. And so I actually was supposed to record a podcast with Tony the next day.
Oh, I
So
didn't
we
know
were
that.
we were scheduled for Tuesday to do a podcast, and here's what I wanted to talk about. We were going to talk. He's done the whole life cycles of a church, and my thing was, it does is it in the life cycle of a church, is death part of that?
Mm. Wow.
Everything else as a life cycle eventually dies. And not the big C church, but the little churches.
Right.
Do they actually get to a point where it's time for them to die, and then something else be born out of it? And I wanted to talk that through,
Wow.
and he passed the day before. And so
Wow.
yeah, it really hit, it was like a punch in the gut to me. So with that in mind, with the building the house in mind, and then since all of this, the hurricane just came through and the eye passed over our new house. And so we've been without power for 12 days. We did put in a generator, but dude, it's just been like one thing after another. And
Wow.
so I feel like sometimes people in ministry, this is the way they live every day. I
Yeah.
think maybe you were at that point when you got to the place where you're going, I can't keep doing this anymore at Saddleback. So what
Yeah.
I'd like to do today is, first of all, I'd just like for you to set this up, just speak to anyone who might be in that frazzled state. And then I want us to offer some ways they can replenish today. I want
Yeah.
today to be more of a, here's some practical things you can do if you find yourself in one of these places, or just life doesn't make sense. But just, I
Yeah.
mean, if someone's listening right now and they're like, do I want to listen to this or not? Tell them why they should listen to the rest of this podcast.
Well, first off, I would just want to say I have a tremendous amount of empathy and appreciation for the people who are really like down in the trenches, serving on the front lines, living with the pressure and the demands. Because at least in my lifetime, Dale, and I'm older than you, I'm 66,
Yeah, you've been married 46 years.
46
We've been
years.
married 42 years. So we're
Yeah.
trying to catch you.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right behind me, right on my
Yeah.
tail.
Uh-huh.
So I just feel like we're living in a day when ministry has never been more complex.
Yeah.
Pastors have never been more scrutinized, criticized, the cultural issues at a level of complexity. And so no wonder pastors are struggling with mental health and feeling burned out and wondering whether or not they want to keep going on. And so my heart goes out because there is a level of complexity and stress, I think, today for pastors that has not been true, at least in my lifetime. And I remember when I was in the swirl of the hairball of trying to figure out whether or not I was going to stay at Saddleback or whether we
Yep.
should leave. And Rick and I had 4 pretty lengthy conversations together over about 6 months. And I remember one day just having this thought, like my deepest longing was not for a different ministry or even a different way to do ministry. It was for a different way to do life.
Yep.
And I feel like where a lot of pastors are, like it's not you need a new sermon series or a different strategy for Easter. I think it's really more about even more basic about like how am I going to live my life and actually be a healthy person
Yes.
so that then I can lead from that place. Because if you neglect being a healthy person, I just feel like your runway is not that long till you're going to be out of ministry. And
Lance,
so this is a moment where people got to lean into that.
I think that, and I've talked about this many times before. I think we caught, I don't know that it was taught, but that sacrifice of our soul is
Mhm.
expected to be in ministry. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody just blatantly say that you're supposed to do that, but pastors just don't take care of themselves.
Right.
I remember growing up in a traditional Baptist church, and a very overweight pastor would get up and preach a message about smoking and drinking and all the big things that we weren't supposed to do as Baptists. But I'm thinking, but you weigh 400 pounds and you're eating fried chicken 5 times a day. I mean, there's no difference here. You're not taking care of yourself. And Jesus made it clear that, we're supposed to love the Lord God with all our soul. And so he expects us to have healthy souls. But it just seems to me that in ministry, it's noble to
Yeah.
sacrifice that. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah. And I feel like when I was growing up in ministry, it was almost a badge of honor, like,
Yes.
that you burn yourself out after all, burn out for Jesus, was kind of the mentality. And I feel like that's been with us for a long time. I do feel like it's finally beginning to shift,
Yep.
and we're beginning to realize that the lack of self-care has been unhealthy for us and has caused a lot of casualties. And so kind of one of the fundamental principles I work with in Replenish is that self-care is not selfish, it's good stewardship.
Yeah.
And that the best gift you give yourself, your family, your team, your church is a healthy you and a healthy soul. And I feel like finally we're beginning to pay attention to that and realize that that has to be a core message for us because we've seen the results of the side of neglect. And here I want to make this statement too, because this was really helpful to me a number of years ago, is there's a difference between good hard and destructive hard.
Okay.
Like we all know ministry is hard and it's
Yes.
challenging. And part of the call of Jesus is to die to ourselves and give ourselves for the sake of the gospel. That's good hard.
Yeah.
But destructive hard is when it becomes soul crushing, when you lose your way and you begin to feel disconnected from Jesus. And then I think then my soul gets in an unhealthy place. And it is a miserable thing to try and do ministry when your soul is empty and exhausted. And so I think we have to discern the line between good heart and destructive heart.
So here's a scenario for you, and I think this speaks to a lot of the people that we minister to at 95 Network. They recognize, okay, I need to take care of myself. I've listened to these people, I listen to these podcasts. Everybody's talking about taking care of your soul, but their congregation doesn't get it. So you're here and you need to, you need to take care of yourself. You want to take care of yourself, but your financial situation is tied to that, and in so many cases, pastors they're barely getting by anyway. What do you do if you're jammed up like that and you've got a church that doesn't understand, but you need to make a difference? What would you say to someone if they were talking to you about that?
Well, one, I would have a lot of grace and care and empathy for that situation of a pastor who feels like they are in that stuck place. And
Hmm.
there's probably no easy way out, no magic pill or bullet that is going to be the, one size fits all solution to that. So I think one, just to have care and empathy, but then I think there's always two parts to a journey like what you're describing, Dale. I think there's the internal journey of I got to still lead my own soul that is apart from my job description or apart from what the church pays me, like really believing that I can live from a healthy soul no matter what my external circumstances. And
Good.
that it goes back to self-leadership. And I think about Deuteronomy 13 when the Lord calls the nation of Israel to return to him. And he says, if you'll return to me, I'll prosper you. I'll give you, kids. I'll protect you from your enemies. You'll
Hmm.
delight in me and I'll delight in you. And then in verse 11 of Deuteronomy 30, he says this, now what I'm describing to you today, God says, is actually available to you. It's not beyond your reach. It's not outside of your purview, like it actually is accessible to you. And to me, it's an invitation to self-leadership. Like God says, this abundant life I've talked about, it actually literally is available to me.
Yes.
And every resource I need, according to 2 Peter 1, I already have. And
Yes.
so I've got the internal resources for that. So there's the internal journey, but then there's the external journey of I probably got to have some conversations with my board or elders or a group of deacons, or I may need to actually train my congregation about what are realistic expectations on a pastor, or bring in someone like the 95 Network to help coach us through how to create health for the staff and the team and
Yeah.
to make it a priority. And sometimes when I sit with pastors and I will say to them, I can say things to your board that you can't say
That's
because it
right.
would come across as self-serving for you.
Yeah.
But I'm the outsider and I can come in as someone with my level of experience and say some things and be an advocate for you as a leader. And so externally, you have to maybe begin to do some things. And you may have to also like just be willing to let some people be disappointed.
Yep. See,
Go for it.
there's the rub,
Preach it.
brother. There's the rub because we don't want to let anybody down.
Exactly.
I mean, I lived that way, mine morphed into not letting Jesus down. So that you're speaking to them, and in that Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy, remember how the Lord says, okay, look, he's taught the whole chapter, the whole book through. He goes, I'm going to set before you life and death, blessing
Yep.
and cursing. And then what does he say? Oh, by the way, choose life.
Life. Yep. Verse 18.
So he has to tell us to choose life after he says, okay, here's the good way. There's the
Yep.
bad way. Hey, pick the good way.
Yeah. Imagine that.
So sometimes we're not the sharpest sticks in the bunch when the
So
Lord
true.
sets it before us, But there
Yep.
is a wonderful, abundant life, and I do not believe Jesus ever intended for ministry to be as taxing on us
Yeah.
as it has become. What do
So
you?
let me take it back to Deuteronomy 30 again. If you go to the
Mhm.
very end of the chapter, you find these 6 words that are, I think, the capstone of the entire chapter, where he says, for the Lord is your life. And for
Yes.
me, it's always been a good reminder, like, no, the church is not my life. The ministry is not my life. Jesus is my life. And I got to get that right first and lead out of that place. And because the church is not my entire identity or my entire sense of significance or everything in my life. And so again, I want to serve the bride faithfully, but first off, it's about my personal relationship with Jesus and then leading from that place.
When we do our Soul Care Essentials conference, one of the things we talk about on the fourth part of the first session is insecurity. And I think what happens is so many of us, we don't live the way you just described. We define ourselves as pastor this or apostle that, or some kind of title. And that ministry is not who we are. It's what we do. And it's very difficult, I think, for pastors to pull out of that mindset and really begin to focus on creating a healthy soul. I think that happens a lot.
This has been like a 60-year journey that I'm still on. This whole people-pleasing, approval addict, putting way too much weight on either people's criticism or praise of me. And there's a word that's become a really important word to me in recent years. It's a psychological term, but it's actually a biblical concept. And it's the idea of differentiation. And the idea is that I can be present with you. I love you. I care about you. I'm interested in you, but I don't need something from you that's unhealthy. Your opinion of me or what you say about me doesn't have to either validate or invalidate who I am. And I can live in that place of not needing your approval to know who I am in Christ and to actually lead from that place as a pastor. And yet it's so hard, because I remember when I would get the nasty email or that offhanded comment by somebody leaving church, or I would find out third hand that someone had left the church because they were mad about something I had done or said. And, I remember this old statement that compliments are written in the sand, but criticism is written in wet cement.
Yeah.
And for those of us in ministry, those criticisms just grind on our soul and get imprinted on us. And part of our journey has to be to release that people pleasing and live from a different place. And I feel like I'm better than I used to be, but it's still a journey for me when it comes to that.
I want to ask you this question, and it may be too personal. And if it is, you could say that's too personal.
It'll be fine.
But when you started to step away from Saddleback, you're having this conversation with Rick Warren, the Rick Warren, and I doubt that he was thrilled. He might have been, I don't know, but so how did you handle that pressure then? Because I know you say you want to be people pleasing, and you don't want to let down Rick Warren.
No. And it was in many ways a dream role that I thought I would spend the rest of my days in. And I remember, a couple of things, very specific moments come to my mind, Dale. I remember I was driving up to meet Rick at his home one day during this season. And I just remember having this overwhelming feeling of like, Lance, who do you think you are? Like, you're having a conversation like with one of the guys who's one of the most influential Christians in the world, and about issues you've got and things you're struggling with, and like, who are you? And I just remember, though, almost just a few seconds later, like just this peace came over me, like the Lord just reminded me, like, hey, this is important. You need to have this conversation. This is about your journey, and I care about you as much as I do Rick Warren. And just that sense of God's personal care in my life was really a moment for me. But I also remember when I had made the decision to leave, I remember it was like I had this little voice in my ear saying to me, when you leave here, no one's going to care what you have to say anymore. Because what gives you credibility is not you, Lance, it's the name of the church that you build. And there was a journey for me, Dale, of surrender, where I feel like I had to allow the Lord to say to me, Lance, at the end of the day, I'm going to hold you accountable for your faithfulness to my call, not the name of the church that you serve. And so it was a hard, thing, but I'm just grateful because it was some sweet moments where I feel like I came to the end of myself, and I could rest at least somewhat in God's grace and provision. And again, so grateful for the years I had there.
Sure.
But man, the other good thing I've learned is there's life on the other side of that.
Yeah.
Like God has been so good, and so much of who I am today is because I went through some of both the good things and the hard things there.
Sure. You know, I don't have the Rick Warren story, but my story, in the year 2000, John Maxwell tried to hire me to work for him.
Mm,
And I at that time thought, I thought John Maxwell hung the moon. I mean, I still
absolutely.
think the world of John.
Yep.
He's greatly influenced my life, but it was not the right time. It wasn't the right season. And so I literally, Gina and I flew on a private plane. When I say private plane, there was a pilot, John, Gina, and me. So that's pretty
Wow.
private. And we flew from Atlanta. They brought me to Atlanta to show me my new office I was gonna have and all this stuff. And we flew from there to South Carolina to Nashville and back. And on the flight back from Nashville, it's when I told him I wasn't gonna take the job. And I knew I wasn't ready. 2 weeks later, our church split. Now I'm
Mm,
pastoring a church of less than 200 people at the time, and it was one of those mean ones. And so I
wow.
went from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. And then it felt like, and this is kind of when Tony intersected me. I went on a 14 years of being put on the shelf.
Wow.
14 years, not doing anything in ministry, went back into construction. I thought, my life's done. My ministry life is done. So I can relate a lot to that feeling of, just I'm out in the desert. But I think about Elijah, and I think about the fact that he laid down under a tree and said, "Okay, I can't take this anymore. I'm done."
Yep.
And the Lord replenished him before he dealt with this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's do
Absolutely.
this. I want to take a short break. We're going to come right back, and I want us to give some practical things that have worked for you, that you know of or you've written about, that may help some folks who are in this place where they're going, "Okay, these guys are talking right to me. Help me, fellas." Okay, so short break. We'll be right back. Back here with Lance Witt, just talking through practical life and how to replenish yourself. So, Lance,
Yeah.
you wrote replenish. What are some practical things that pastors can do or any leader can do who finds himself where they're just, as I described about myself, I felt like I was put on the shelf, or maybe they're in the midst of they're in the midst of the battle. They're still leading the church, but they are not healthy. What are some practical things we can do to kind of get ourselves heading in the right direction?
I think this probably doesn't feel as practical, but I think it's actually a really important first step, Dale. And for me, it always comes down to kind of a moment of self-leadership. I remember in the story of the prodigal son, when it says in Luke 15 that he came to himself.
Yes,
That
yes.
there's this moment where he realizes, hey, I don't have to stay where I am.
There you go.
My past doesn't have to dictate my future. I can change the trajectory of my life. And I think for a lot of pastors, it's kind of having this moment like, hey, I am who I am because of choices I've made. There are some things in my past that have impacted me, certainly, but um, I don't have to be where I am internally
Yeah.
and in my soul. And for me, that was, and it really came out of some pain in our marriage, where one day Connie looked at me and I was kind of playing the victim card of, we'd had another fight and she was frustrated because I was never home. And I was going, hey, this just comes with the price of ministry
Yeah.
and it's just for a season. And then she looked at me and said, there's always a reason or a season why you can't be who you're supposed to be.
Ooh, ooh,
And
ooh, ooh,
um,
ooh.
man,
That's a
and it
t-shirt.
was a gut punch to say, like, wow, like I was who I was because of choices I made. And that
Mhm.
was a wake-up call for me to finally begin to take greater responsibility for leading my own soul. So I think a lot of it starts there. And once you sort of put that stake in the ground, now you can begin to make some practical changes. And I would say, if I was going to say the absolute most practical shift I began to make was around the rhythm and pace of my life.
Okay.
And I began to actually value, life-giving hobbies. I began to learn how to practice Sabbath. I began to learn how to create space and have solitude in my life and take vacations and things that I never did in those years I was at Saddleback. And I remember when I left Saddleback and I started remember trying to practice Sabbath, I hated it because even if I was still on the outside or slowing down or trying to be more restful, on the inside, my RPMs were still redlining. So I had a restlessness inside that kept me from being able to even slow down much on the outside. And so for me, the pace, the rhythm, the schedule, like to me, that's one of the big ones that I think. And again, I think you got to get really proactive with this. And, I would say I had a faulty theology of availability. I thought
Talk through that a little bit.
because as a pastor, if anybody had a need or a request of me, my answer automatically had to be yes.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when you go to the Gospels, that's not how Jesus lived.
Mm-mm.
He pulled away at times to
Yes.
rest. He didn't meet every need, heal every person. And so I think realizing you have limits and God made you a person before he made you a pastor, and that you need a healthy rhythm just like your people in your congregation do, and to accept that as a person. So how's that been for you
Well,
learning to do?
so here's the thing. As we've done the Soul Care Essentials Conference, and that again, the opening session is all we do 3 sessions. One is your private life, which is what's going on inside of you. The second session we do is your personal life, which is your relationships, your marriage, your kids, and then the third session we do is about your professional life. In the private life section, I have been shocked, Lance, and you nailed it. I have been shocked at the amount of pastors who push back when we say God expects you to Sabbath.
Yeah.
They look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language. And I actually have pastors. This has been the one that's kind of like, well, I don't know what to do with this. I've had them look at me and say, I know what you're saying is correct, but I'm just not going to do it. I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
But because what happens is I think they can't they've assumed Jesus's role in the church at times where
Yeah.
they wanted to provide ministry that he needs to do, and they have a hard time letting go of anything. They have a hard time saying no, or always having to say yes to everything is what they typically do, but they can't turn it off. That I think that's the thing that I see is, like they can't go on vacation because if they do, they take their phone. They're constantly checking in with the service or what's going on at church, and that's very unhealthy.
Yeah. I whenever I teach on Sabbath now, early on in my talk, I will make the statement that you need to have your own theological and biblical conviction about this, because if you don't come to a biblical conviction that this is actually one of the 10 commandments, it's God's best for you. If you don't have that conviction, the whirlwind of busyness in your church will always win the day. So you've got to study it for yourself. And I think come to a place where you go, oh, actually, I'm violating a commandment if I ignore this or act like it's not important. And again, I think, like you said, we end up having this sort of Messiah complex, and realizing, instead of realizing, like, hey, the church is not yours, and it can get by without you for 24 hours.
Yep.
And there's a couple of photos sometimes I'll show when I'm talking on Sabbath, and it's photos that take place in Manhattan. So there's the statue of Atlas, and he's carrying the world on his shoulders, and he's got, he's weighted down. And I feel like that's where a lot of pastors are. But you walk across the street into St. Patrick's Cathedral, walk up to the front, and there's a statue that looks like it's like maybe 8-year-old Jesus, and he's got the entire world in his hand. And for me, that's what Sabbath does, is it recalibrates my perspective and reminds me, like, hey, Lance, you're not the Messiah. God didn't ask you to carry the whole world and the burden of everything in your church. He's actually got it in his hand, and it's okay for you to take a break. And I feel like, Dale, there's this rhythm, biblical rhythm that runs all the way through the Bible that it can be summarized like this: work really hard and be productive, and then unplug really hard and learn how to rest and restore. And a lot of pastors are exhausted because we've not embraced that rhythm. We should be productive. We should work really hard. And when you're on the clock, do a great job. But when you unplug really hard.
Yes.
Like, get away, learn how to rest, do things that restore your soul, develop a couple of life-giving hobbies.
Yes. Lance, the reality is God introduced the concept of Sabbath in creation.
Exactly.
I mean, he makes the whole world, makes humans, and then Hey, by the way, y'all need to take a day off.
Yeah,
Jesus modeled this for us over and over and over again. Where I mean, in the midst of all the busyness, and I know a lot of people listening are busy, but I'm not sure you're gonna match where Jesus was. And he still would get away. He would withdraw. And he was overwhelmed by the crowds, but he made a decision. And that's what I hope happens out of today's podcast, is that
well, I
people
think
would
that,
go, I just got to make a decision to be
yeah.
healthy.
Yeah, and I want to give you one of the greatest leadership principles I ever learned from Rick Warren, and I think a lot of pastors could benefit from this. Learn to separate decision making from problem solving. So,
Okay.
in other words, what's the right decision? And once I get to the right decision, I can start figuring out how I'm going to get there and what problems I got to overcome to get to that right decision.
Hmm.
And so I think for pastors, it's like the right decision is a healthy rhythm of life.
Yeah.
A right decision is unhurried time with your wife and kids. And, the right decision is, learning to take a vacation. Now then, all right, how am I going to get there? Then you can start figuring out the how, but get to the right decision first. And I feel like so many times in my life, the problem of how to get there kept me from actually articulating the right decision.
That's so good. I will say without a shadow of a doubt, as tired as I have been, as tough as this last 2 years have been, we always take our Sabbath,
Yeah,
and we reconnect. Gene and I reconnect. I rest. I shut it down. There's always a ton of work to be done,
sure.
whether it's ministry or construction or anything else. But I don't do it. That is my day off, and we actually have a date day that day. We put our date day in our Sabbath so that we nothing comes up to mess it up. And it's kept me sane. And I
Yeah.
still have my hair, which hey, I
Well,
thought
apparently I missed out on that one.
well, that you just learned it too late. But it's what's kept me sane. And so when I have pastors look at me and go, "Oh, but I'm so busy," and I'm going, "That's the point.
Yeah, that's why
You're
you
you're,
need.
you're making my point here. You're not supposed to be so busy. It's not your church.
Yeah,
It's His church. And when you get to a place to where your work at the church usurps your relationship with Jesus, it's not healthy, and it never ends well.
yeah.
It never ends well.
And I think about, to me, the core teaching of Jesus on this, it comes in the book of Mark when he reminded us that man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. Like it
Yeah.
was not meant to be a religious burden or obligation on us. It's actually a gift from the Lord. And so to me, I think sometimes like pastors hear Sabbath as like another thing you have to
You got
do
to do. Hmm.
instead of like, no, this is actually an amazing gift. And
Yes.
that your life will be better and you'll be a better husband and dad and friend if you can learn how to implement this into your life. And I think when you get to be healthy, it's something you actually look forward to, and it
Yeah.
is so life-giving. And at the end of a busy, intense week, you go, oh, but Sabbath is coming.
It's gotten
And
me
it
through
feels
lots of
like
weeks.
that gift,
It's got me
right?
through lots of weeks knowing, hey, it's coming. It's coming. It will be here soon. So you talked about creating some hobbies. One of the things I have noticed about pastors, and everyone's not wired to go, to be an outdoorsman, hunt, fish, golf, all that
Sure.
stuff. A lot of pastors specifically don't do those kind of things, but they do need to develop some hobbies. What were some that you did, or how are you wired? I guess I should best ask that.
Yeah, again, I'm an outdoor person, and so for me, I think one of the questions you want to ask in Sabbath is what are activities that actually put life in your soul, that fill up your tank, make you a better person,
Yeah.
and what are the things that drain you, and you're trying to stay away from the things that drain you and put the stuff that puts in. So for me, I play some golf. I'm not a huge, like I don't play every week, but I enjoy golf. I love the mountains. I love hiking. I've gotten into fly fishing in recent years.
Ooh.
I'm an avid reader. I always have been, but in recent years, I've begun to read some things that are just pleasurable for me, like historical
Hmm.
fiction and some novels and stuff that in the past I thought, who has time for that? I need to read another leadership book, right?
Sure.
And so, so finding things like that for me are life-giving. And, I had a friend of mine, he told me he read this definition of a hobby the other day. A hobby is something that you do when you do it, you lose track of time.
There you go. I like that.
And I love that definition. So
That
what
is
is
really
it that
good.
when you do it, you actually lose track of time because you're so caught up in it. It's so enjoyable. You forget what day it is or what time of the day or how long you've been doing it.
Sure. Well, see, I'm, one of the things I've done for 30 years is I'm a deer hunter, but I've gotten
Yeah,
to the point now where it's not about harvesting a deer. It's about sitting up in a tree for 3 hours. And for some people, they're like,
love it.
that sounds awful. And honestly, as I've gotten older, I don't go out when it's really, really cold as much as I used to. It used to be like a challenge to do that. And then I'm going, but no one cares. So, but it's just to be out in nature and, hear the squirrels and a lot of times, I'll see a deer and just let it walk. I don't know what it is about that replenishes my soul, but I
I,
know the value of it.
and I think, Dale, some people hear Sabbath and they think it's like, oh, you're just passive all day. You just kind of sit in your recliner or just have a 24-hour quiet time. And I don't think that is the definition of
Mm-mm.
Sabbath. I think it's like, what is it that when you do it puts life in you? Now, if you get to the end of your Sabbath and you're more exhausted than when you started, that's probably
Yeah,
something
you
you
push
should
too
pay
much.
attention to.
Yeah.
Like my wife, because I'm such an active person, my wife has challenged me a few times, like, doesn't feel to me like your Sabbath is very restful. Looks fun,
Yeah.
but not always restful. So I'm trying to be conscious of like, it's okay to be active and to do some things that put life in me, but I do want it to be a day that does feel restful and restorative
Sure.
to me.
Pastor Willie George talked about a schedule of a human years ago, and I never will forget this because he talked about how he said, we are supposed to work 6 days a week and then take a day off. That's the way God designed us. He said, but uh, doing your yard work, washing your car, all that stuff on your Sabbath is work still. And he said what he does is he works 5 days a week at his job, whatever, and pastoring the church at that. But that then he had Saturday or whatever day it was. That's when he did the chores. It was still work, but it's chores. And so I think we have to find that balance because I see a lot of guys out and oh, well, that's when I get my grass cut. And well, I mean, and I will say this: some people really enjoy cutting grass. Some of my best sermons came from cutting grass because I used to have 2 acre and
Yeah,
some of the people that I told off the most, I did it cutting grass. I never actually talked to them, but in my head
yeah,
for 2 hours, I really let off some steam. And then if
yeah,
you're a golfer, you can do this. I had a pastor friend who actually would take a golf ball and write somebody's name on it that he didn't like, and he would hit it. And it would always end up in the pond. So you might need to do that to help
yeah.
process some things.
That's
I want
funny.
to allow enough time for this too, because we've given us a few practical things.
Okay.
But also, if someone's at a place where they need counseling, they need to talk to somebody. What do you tell them to do?
Well, I do. I like go get the counseling, go get a therapist. I think, if it's a spiritual, like if you're feeling spiritually stuck, I would say maybe look for someone who can do spiritual direction with you, who's more trained in sort of the ways of the soul.
Mm.
I would say if you're going to go get counseling, obviously find a great biblical Christian counselor that you can lean into. And it may be that because of your unique area, maybe you're not comfortable going to someone locally.
Yep.
There's so many great options on Zoom these days. And
Yes.
I think all of us have gotten comfortable with sort of video calls and Zoom calls. And so find a counselor around the country. There are a lot of people who work with pastors and ministry leaders.
Hmm.
And, I'm sure you know somebody who's been to a counselor, knows a counselor, maybe lives in a different state that you can meet with by Zoom. And finally, I think we're beginning to remove the stigma
Yes.
around counseling and that, like, hey, it's a good practice for me, whether it's my marriage or my own soul, or I need an executive coach to help me be a better pastor.
Mhm.
Like, we need all the outside help we can get. And so I would just say lean in and go. And I would also say this because I've had this experience. You find a counselor and it's not a great fit for you, or there's not good chemistry, it's
Change.
okay. Go find another one.
That's right.
Like, you have a session or two and it's not really feels like it's meeting your need. You wouldn't stick with a dentist who you don't,
Mm-mm.
feel like is doing a
Nope.
great job for you. So go find another counselor. And there are so many great options out there these days. So I think it would benefit all of us.
I would say that I consider you to be one of my better friends, and we've actually only met in person at Tony's funeral.
Yeah.
Our whole conversation, our whole meeting, we had a couple times we were trying to get together and it didn't work out. But so don't downplay the convenience of Zoom, because it's
Yeah.
helpful. And we have several ministries that we can recommend that help you, especially if you want more of an anonymous counseling situation to where you are in another state. We've got some folks we can recommend. We're glad to point you to that direction if you need that. So as we wrap up the podcast today, and someone is at a place where they're going, okay, I need to replenish. I want to replenish. I want the value of replenishing. Um, how can I get started, Lance? What's my first step?
Well, I think the first step would probably be like, one, have a conversation with your spouse. I feel like sometimes that doesn't get enough spotlight of the importance of including our spouse in conversations around, like, how do I get out of this place where I feel stuck? How do
Yeah,
I move forward with my life? What changes would we maybe have to make in terms of how we do life and our schedule and all of that? So I would say that would be one. I would also say another huge step is create some space where you could just get away and do a day of personal retreat and be with the Lord and journal around, like, what do I love about my life right now? Where do I feel stuck? What's the hope for my desired future? So I've created this process that we call the One Life process, and it's
hmm
a day and a half in-person experience where we walk through a set of tools to help people get to clarity around their life and what really matters to them, and how do they want to live their life, and what are the declarations they're going to make about how they're going to move forward. And we just set aside a large block of time to talk through everything in their world to help them get clear around how they're going to move forward with their life. And I feel like sometimes with pastors, they're so busy and there's so much clutter, they don't really take the time to just get alone with God
yep,
and get clear around what is going to need to change. And then I would say also, you've got to actually begin to order your life around what you say is most important.
true.
And that begins by you grabbing your calendar by the throat and getting proactive about rhythms and Sabbath and date nights and things that are healthy and life-giving to you outside of ministry. So I
Man,
think those would be some good steps.
you're so full of wisdom. I'm so glad you went through all the hell you went through.
Thank you, I think.
I'm so proud of you, because you let God redeem it. You let God take the difficulties and the stress and the pressures. And honestly, Lance, we're in our 60s,
Yeah.
and we're still here. And the reason I say that is because there's so many who started when we did, who aren't here anymore. And I don't mean like passed away, but just aren't in ministry anymore, because
Yeah.
it got them. And our goal and our hope for everyone listening to this podcast is that you can have a healthy ministry. In fact, if you look at your wife and tell her you're not doing well, she may look back at you and say, well, I'm not doing well either. Well, then deal with it. I
Yeah.
had a pastor friend that lost his marriage, and he told me, when I talked to him about it, I said, well, what happened? He said, well, we've been in trouble for like 7 years. And I'm going, then why didn't you get help?
Yeah.
Why did
Yeah.
you wait until it got too far gone? And so that's what my hope is for these podcasts. We've been in this kind of flow for a while. Just folks, get help, get healthy, follow the model Jesus gave us. He didn't intend for ministry to destroy you. He wants
Yeah.
you to have a fruitful ministry. And honestly, the most important thing I learned when I went through all the stuff that I did from Bob Hamp was that Jesus wants me to do ministry from him and not for him.
That's so
That
good.
changed my life
Mm.
dramatically because of the pressure that I felt.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you. Every time I'm with you, around you, I enjoy you so much. You are just real and authentic. I feel like your life is kind of an open book, and you share your struggles and the stresses and what it's like to build a house and all of that. And I just have such respect for you. Thank you for what you do with the 95 Network, the way that you are a friend and a practical help to pastors who are out there doing it. So I'm so grateful to be able to call you a friend.
Well, I appreciate that so much. I guess the thing in the back of my mind, Lance, it's always there. When I was pastoring our small church, and I reached out to people, and I I didn't get any response. And I
Mm,
used to lay on the floor in my office and cry for a friend.
mm,
I mean, there was multiple times I laid on the floor in my office and just wept and just said, God, I need a friend. I'm not talking about my wife or my kids. I'm talking about
right.
just a friend. And I don't want anyone who ever comes in contact with 95 Network to ever feel that way.
Yeah.
I want them to know they've got a
That's
friend
powerful.
in Lance Witt. They got a friend in Dale Sellers. They've got a friend in Replenish. They've got a friend at 95 Network. You are not alone, and Jesus doesn't want you operating that way. So thank you, man. Thank you for your heart, for your all you're doing for the kingdom, and I can't wait till we talk again.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you. Hope you have a great day.
You too, man. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.